Good morning, everyone. We're going to get started. I've never seen this room this crowded for good reason this morning. I'm Tom Wolf, and I'm a member of the HASP Science, Medicine, and Technology Committee. And I'm here to introduce Dr. David Myers, who's really a Hope College legend. Dr. Myers earned his MA and PhD in social psychology from the University of Iowa in 1967, and he spent almost his entire career as a professor at Hope College. Dr. Myers is the author of 18 books, and with the support from National Science Foundation grants, he has published research in dozens of scientific periodicals and dozens of magazines. This morning, Dr. Myers will illustrate widely shared misinformation and disinformation with examples of people believing things that are plainly untrue. He will also discuss the psychological mechanisms that enable and sustain false beliefs. And finally, he will illustrate the contributions of scientific inquiry, education, and faith-based humility to restraining misinformation and disinformation. Dr. Myers.
Thank you. Thank you, and it's great to be here sitting among so many friends and familiar faces. I'm 80 years old, and I really should be out there in the audience with you, but I have a rather weird position in that I'm not yet retired, contrary to much popular opinion, but I have drawn no salary for the last 25 years. My children all live thousands of miles away. I don't play golf, and I love what I do, so they let me keep doing it. You know, I don't cost them anything except the heat and light and computer connections. So this is a big topic today. St. Paul, 2 millennia ago, anticipated a time coming when people will turn away from listening to the truth and wander away to myths. And I'd like to suggest to you that that time is now. We live in a post-truth era, when facts are so often less influential in shaping public opinion than appeals to emotion. Scott Adams wrote a book not long back on how to persuade people in a world where facts don't matter. The world of facts don't matter is the subject of a New Yorker cartoon. I'm sorry, Jenny, your answer was correct, but Kevin shouted his incorrect answer over yours, so he gets the points. And indeed, there's some wisdom to this cartoon. There's a lot of evidence that on the internet, lies spread faster than truth. Jonathan Swift anticipated this 3 millennia ago. A lie can travel halfway around the world while the truth is putting on its shoes. On Facebook, misinformation gets 6 times more clicks than factual news. Just last month, the Nobel Prize Committee had a worldwide summit in New York City, focused on misinformation, which it regards as one of the greatest threats to our society today. And so we need to have a conversation about how to combat misinformation. And we need to have that conversation because our healthy civil democracy depends on an informed public, on people who believe what's true rather than what's plainly wrong. And so as Tom has indicated, what I'd like to do today is really 3 things. One, give you 10, to me, striking examples of large numbers of people, in some cases, most people, believing something that's not just untrue, but is the direct opposite of what is demonstrably and easily demonstrated to be factually true. Then I want to suggest to you some psychological mechanisms that help us account for this misinformation. And then third, to suggest some antidotes in the form of the practice of science and of the kind of education that we're doing here at Hope College. Okay, so we'll start with 10 examples. See if these strike you and make you go like this, like they do me. The first is people's beliefs about COVID. Now, those of you who are physicians know there's a lot of misinformation about vaccines and so forth. But do you know that there's a couple other phenomena related to COVID fears? One is that vaccinated people fear COVID more than unvaccinated people. And the second is that young adults who are much less at mortal risk fear it as much as do the old, or have done so anyway. First, this evidence that more protected people feel less protected. The Surgeon General has noticed this phenomena in national surveys. Vaccinated people may overestimate their peril, just as unvaccinated people may underestimate it. And he's speaking about national surveys such as this one that found that fully vaccinated people, 72% of them, were really still afraid, despite being vaccinated, that this could take their lives, while those who were not vaccinated or not fully vaccinated were much less likely to fear it. Even though at the time the survey was done, the fatality rate for those unvaccinated was many times higher than it was for those vaccinated, because the vaccine, though it doesn't protect us against necessarily getting the disease, is very helpful as protection against being a casualty of it. But consider a second weird phenomenon, and that is that age has been strongly correlated with COVID mortality risk. That is, young adults have a comparatively infinitesimal risk of COVID death. We see this in these data from 4 different countries showing who's dying as a function of age. And as you can see, if you go lower down the graph, you're getting older and older people. That's where the casualties are. That's where the deaths are. And yet, young adults, at least early in the COVID experience, were just as fearful as were older adults. So Gallup, for example, did a worldwide survey of more than 100,000 people and found that 40% of 18 to 29-year-olds were really afraid of COVID, which was exactly the same as 65-year-olds and older, even though there's a dramatic difference in their risk. People were afraid to send their children back to school in the fall because they might get COVID and die. In the United States, in the first year and a half of COVID, some did die who were under 25, nearly 1,600. But that rate of death as a proportion of the population was just about the same as you would expect from death due to seasonal flu in that age. I did a little back of the envelope calculation of how many young adults under 25 who would have expected to die in vehicle accidents during that same time period, and came up with an estimate of about 10,000. That is about 6 times as whatever your risk was of COVID. If you were under 25, your risk of driving in a car were about 6 times as great. And actually later, with a more comprehensive time period, the CDC did that calculation for me and found that actually young adults over the first 2 years of COVID were 9 times more likely to die in vehicle accidents than of COVID. So I'm not saying that COVID was no risk to young adults, but however afraid they were of it, they should have been 9 times more fearful of driving in a car. And this is just one example of a larger category of kind of misinformation, which is the tendency of people to fear the wrong things. One of my favorite examples is people's fears of flying versus driving. The Gallup organization, in one of its surveys a while back, found that only 40% of Americans fly without feeling some anxiety about doing so, despite the fact that mile per mile in the last decade, flying on a commercial aircraft has been 595 times safer than driving. When I leave this meeting, I'm driving to Grand Rapids Airport to fly to New Orleans. I believe these data. The most anxious part of the trip is my drive to the Grand Rapids Airport. Once I'm in the loving care of Delta Airlines, I relax. Knowing these data, I did a little prediction and actually published it in a news magazine of the Association for Psychological Science. I predicted, this was after 9/11, and people were afraid to fly. And so going to Florida for Christmas or spring break, people were driving rather than flying. And so we were driving more miles and flying fewer miles. And so I predicted that if we drove half those unflown miles, then in the next year, we could expect that an additional 800 Americans would die on America's highways, that the terrorists would keep killing us unseen through our increased driving. What I didn't think to do, and I kicked myself, is actually a couple of years later, check to see whether that was true. But a German researcher, having read that prediction, decided to check it out. And here's what he found. This is first of all, the month-per-month car accident fatality rate in the United States in the 5 years preceding the year 2001. And now we're going to look at 2001. And you can see about 3,000 people a month with some month-to-month variation die in vehicle accidents. It's exactly the same until you get to the last 3 months when in excess 353 people died. Over the ensuing year, in excess 1,500 people died. I had the right idea, but I actually underestimated. So long after 9/11, the terrorists were killing more people in America's cars than died on those 4 ill-fated planes. We often fear the wrong things, and there's so many ways in kind of the medical literature in which people's fears of different vulnerabilities to death and to different diseases are essentially uncorrelated with their actual risk. The next example is really striking, and it's really socially and politically relevant, and that is people's perceptions of crime. Crime has been dropping in the United States, but it feels like it's been rising. First, as to the perceptions, Gallup each year asks Americans, is there more crime in the United States than there was a year ago? And as you can see, every year for the last 2 decades, about 7 in 10 people say, yes, there's more crime this year than there was last year. Last year, they said there was more crime then than the year before, and et cetera, back 20 years. And politicians are reminding us of this. The murder rate's the highest it's been in 47 years. We have blood, death, and suffering on a scale once unthinkable. Violent crime is at record highs in our streets and neighborhoods, Kevin McCarthy said just very recently. And just last month, Ron DeSantis lamented crime infesting our cities. And this is not just Republican politicians. This is Democrats too. The blue and the red lines all show about 7 in 10 people think that crime is rising in the United States. Okay, that's what people believe. Here's the simple facts. First of all, we have the rate of crime victimizations as aggregated by the Bureau of Justice Statistics in annual surveys of the American population. People are reporting being victimized less by crime. Is there less crime? This is the violent crime rate as aggregated from America's law enforcement agencies by the FBI. This is the property crime rate. And as you can see, it has plummeted. It is a fraction of what it was back in the early 1990s. And as to those drug and crime infested cities like New York, where we see so many homicides play out in drama, this is what's happened to the homicide rate in New York City. Oh, but people say there are certain demographic groups like African Americans have a high incarceration rate. The modal American thinks that over the most recent dozen years when this was surveyed, that Black incarceration increased by 25%, when actually it decreased by 35%. There's a kind of general surmise, by the way, if you ask people about their own lives and their neighborhoods, their blocks, their town versus the nation, and they will tell you that my town, my neighborhood, they're good, healthy places. I live in the central city of Holland. It's great. I love it. But the rest of America, what we'll call the cognitively available America seen on TV, it's getting scary worse. And you can generalize this. If you ask people worldwide about how happy they are, the percent who say they're at least rather happy, if not very happy, is in the upper 80s, as you can see, if you take all these blue dots and drop them down to the line below. If you ask them another question, what percent of the people in your country, how do they describe themselves, the average person? How would the average American respond, for example? Well, if you just follow this across to the left, you can see about 85% of people globally think their lives are reasonably happy, but think that only about 50% of other people's lives are very happy. The Atlantic magazine had an article not long ago kind of summarizing this research and what it shows. The widespread perception that the world is going to hell in a handbasket. It's a terrible place, but my life and my neighborhood are fine. And just within the last week, a couple colleagues out of Harvard published an article in Nature that summarized data from 60 nations across 70 years, finding that everywhere and at all modern times, people think that other people are less kind, honest, nice, and good than they used to be. The world is going downhill. Even though for pretty much any awful thing you can think of, war, murder, slavery, child abuse, people seem to be doing less of it now than they used to. The day after this was published, Gallup published its annual report on Americans' view of moral values. And as you can see, a record number, that's 83% on the far right, think that the state of moral values in the nation as a whole is getting worse. So I'm doing okay. My neighborhood's doing okay. But the country, crime is rising. It's a terrible place. Things are catastrophic in the United States. Okay. Number 4 is our perceptions in particular of immigrant crime. Again, we have both political kind of prognostication about this and actual data on what people think. President Trump has reminded us, as you know, that when Mexico sends its people, they're bringing drugs, crime, they're rapists. Every day, sanctuary cities are unleashing vicious predators and bloodthirsty killers. Criminal elements are pouring in. And many Americans agree with them. In a Gallup survey during the Trump presidency, 5 times more Americans said immigrants made the crime situation worse than said that they made it better. So is it in fact the case that undocumented immigrants are disproportionately criminal and more likely to end up incarcerated? The conservative Wall Street Journal has said that's a myth. That's just not true. The Libertarian Cato Institute note that with few exceptions, my microphone fell off. Notes that, as you can see here, the incarceration rate of undocumented immigrants, that's the yellow bar in the middle, is in most studies lower than that of people born in the United States. Some studies find it's about the same, but by and large, there's certainly no tendency for undocumented immigrants to be more crime prone, despite the widespread belief that they are. By the way, so far, it seems like I've been giving you examples of mostly ding the political right. Let me give you some that ding the political left, because the phenomenon, the biases are really bipartisan. So here's an example. How many unarmed Black men were killed by police in 2021? Among those who were very liberal, as you can see, about 42% thought it was about 100, and 28%, if I can read the slide here, thought it was about 1,000. If you look at the other end of the political spectrum, 47% of those who were very conservative thought it was about 10. The actual number, tracked by the Washington Post, which monitors this, was 11. So the conservatives were right here. The progressives were wrong. Again, you have very vivid examples portrayed in the media and over again, and it affects, for reasons we'll note a little later on, people's judgments. Example number 5 is what people think about the economy and how it's doing. There's a widespread belief over time that, like crime, unemployment is getting worse. So, for example, at the time of the 2016 elections, 2/3 of those who voted Republican said that unemployment had increased during the Obama administration. This is what happened to unemployment during the Obama administration. As you can see, it plummeted. And that belief extends into the near present. So in 2022, Americans were asked whether the nation is experiencing more job growth than usual. This was in February of 22, and only 19% of people thought it was. And if you look at the next 2 columns, you can see Republicans were less likely to think the job growth was increasing, but even Democrats agreed it wasn't happening. So this is bipartisan belief, even though this is what had happened during that previous 12-month period to the unemployment level. More jobs were created post-pandemic in that 1 year than ever before in the history of the United States. And yet people didn't see it happening right in front of their very eyes. Again, the phenomenon is such that we don't apply this to our own situation. If people are asked, as the Federal Reserve Board asked a national sample of Americans recently about their own economic welfare, 3 in 4 of us say, hey, we're doing okay. And not surprising that most Americans would feel like they're doing okay. Job satisfaction is at an all-time high. The unemployment rate in the United States is now at a 50-year low. The inflation rate, which was very high a year ago, has come down to not quite average normal level, but it's getting there. It's headed in that direction. And the gross domestic product, which is the index of the national output of goods and services, is at the highest ever level. Those are like good things, aren't they? But if Americans are asked, as they also were at this very same time, to assess the national economy, the number who said it was good or excellent was down to 18%. So the economy is in a terrible shape, says the average American. And if you ask how various political leaders are doing, only a third say that the president is doing even a fair amount of good in terms of managing the economy. And if you look down the Republican leaders in Congress, they don't give them much better marks either. By the way, I want to again emphasize that this misinformation and this tendency to bias thinking is bipartisan. So, for example, Peter Ditto at University of California at Irvine has digested a lot of this research and found that it's in both liberals and conservatives and at virtually identical levels. And so let me give you an example of kind of progressives kind of misperceiving economic reality. Did inflation rise or fall during the Reagan presidency? Just after the Reagan presidency ended, people were asked that question. And only 8% of Democrats thought that inflation had improved under President Reagan, whereas the actual inflation rate had dropped precipitously. In fact, this shows you what happened to the inflation rate. And yet Democrats who had just lived through it didn't see it. They thought inflation hadn't gotten any better under President Reagan. Okay, we're halfway through. Some of the remaining examples will go quicker. But so far, I mean, do you share my kind of like, what is this? Why do people think so askew from reality? Some more examples. Some of these can be quicker. What percent of people in the United States are gay or lesbian? That question has been put, by the way, along with other questions. Eli Finkelin's colleague at Northwestern University noted that in Science magazine that Republicans estimate that 32% of Democrats are LGBT, when in reality, 6% Democrats estimate that 38% of Republicans earn over $250,000 a year, when it's 2%. Gallup has done this survey, for example. And in a recent survey, they found that the percentage of the population identifying as LGBT was 5.6%. When people asked, what percent of the population do you think is and would share that identification, the average American answered 24%. And in fact, if there's any small demographic group, I don't know, transgender athletes or something like this that captures a lot of visible attention, I can guarantee you that people will greatly overestimate the preponderance of that population in the overall population. And then there's the whole matter of what the public believes about things that scientists think are settled issues. So, for example, is eating genetically modified food safe? Yes, say 37% of adults in one national survey, and nearly 9 in 10 members of the American Association for the Advancement of Science. And it turns out, this is an example of what we in my discipline, and you may be familiar with this phenomenon, know as the Dunning-Kruger effect, which is the tendency for people who know less about something to feel more confident than people who know more about it. Because it turns out that the less you know about GMOs, the more confident you are in your opposition to them. Or what about climate change? Is climate change mostly due to human activity? It was not far back that 50% of US adults thought it was, while 97% of climate scientists were convinced that it absolutely is the case. Now, an example of that it may warm the hearts a little more of those of you who identify as political conservatives, and that is the question of whether marriage is a contributor to human flourishing. Does it matter? When high school seniors in America were not long ago asked if most people would have fuller and happier lives if they chose legal marriage rather than just staying single or living with somebody, only a third of high school seniors thought that marriage conveyed any advantage or any contribution to human flourishing and longevity. And when a sample of American adults were asked that question, 46%, about half, thought that couples are just as well off if they just abandon the institution of marriage. What do the data show? We have tons of data that's pertinent to this. I happen to have studied happiness and what predicts it as one of my interests. Over time, from national surveys done out of the University of Chicago, here's the percentage of married adults who describe themselves as very happy. And this is never married adults who describe themselves as very happy. Divorced and separated are lower than that. By the way, the dips at the right end are showing you the kind of the emotional effects of COVID, because that's when that survey was done. And we have now longitudinal data that tracks lives through time to see whether if people later marry, and even allowing for the fact that some marriage is going to be miserable and should end and do end, are on average 40 years later people happier if they lived married or not? And the answer is yes. How do children do? Here's the percentage of 3 to 17-year-olds in the United States who've been treated for emotional behavioral problems in the last 12 months as a function of family structure. And as you can see, those children who are raised with intact homes tend to be doing better, and that's after controlling for the educational level, race, and income of the parents. So if you hold those things constant and allow family structure to vary, marriage is a good thing for most people. Now, it's not the only way to have a close relationship. There are other ways in which people can live satisfying, flourishing lives through other kinds of close relationships. This next one, I wondered about whether to dare even mentioning, because I don't want to be partisan, and I'm going to hand out some stuff afterwards that is, I think, genuinely bipartisan here. But was the 2020 election rigged? Is it the case that a massive number of dead people voted? More than half of Republicans believe that's true. Without trying to decide that issue or be political here, let me just suggest how easy it would be to confirm that if it is true, and what you could do if you want to go out and show that. First of all, to the claim that millions of dead people voted, Michigan's Secretary of State has said she's aware of not a single confirmed case of that happening in the state of Michigan. But she might be wrong. And if she is, it would be the easiest thing to demonstrate, because the names of those people are matter of public record. They're available for checking. When you leave here, you can go to City Hall and see who voted and check and look with other information, see if they're dead or alive. The proof is in the pudding. Or what about if it wasn't that way, if there was some other way, there was a conspiracy to corrupt the election? Think of what would had to have happened. The 2016 to 2020 vote shift didn't happen in one place. It was distributed across most states and across most of the 175,000 precincts in the United States. As the Washington Post reported, Democrats gained in nearly every battleground state. So I just out of curiosity looked up for our area Republican counties to see what happened. Here in Ottawa County, which is controlled by Republicans and with a Republican clerk that's recording the votes, the Democratic margin, the Democratic vote went from 31% in 2016 to 38% in 2020. Allegan County to our south, it increased by about 4% in the Democratic. In Kent County, which also had Republican governance, it shifted upward towards Democrats by 9%. Okay, I just picked 3 Republican counties here, but you have to do this across all of the United States. The conspiracy that would accomplish that across 175,000 precincts is hard to fathom, but if it happened, it should be very easy for word of that to leak out and evidence to be able to be presented to the courts. And lacking evidence for that extraordinary claim, then one can ask whether it in fact is really true or whether the courts are correct in saying that it's apparently not true. And another example of people believing something that's not true that has serious consequences. And finally, and this is in some ways the biggest one of all and sort of incorporates some of the rest of these, there is a widespread perception that the world is getting worse when by most measures, not all, the climate crisis looms, teen mental health is in crisis, but by most measures, the world is a better place. Take, for example, world poverty. The Gates Foundation recently funded a survey of 26,000 people in 20 countries that found that 87% of humans believe global poverty has either stayed the same or gotten worse over the last 20 years. Well, here's the fact. This is the percentage of humans living in extreme poverty over the last 30 years, as you can see. And global extreme poverty is now 1/3 of what it was 3 decades ago. Or to give another example, Nicholas Kristof noted a national survey found that the average person believed that 35% of the world's children are vaccinated. Here's the actual rate of child vaccination worldwide. Now 9 in 10 children worldwide are vaccinated. And children worldwide are much more likely to die. So the child mortality rate has plummeted everywhere. There's a wonderful little book called Factfulness by the late Hans Rosling, a Swedish researcher, 10 reasons why we're wrong about the world and why things are better than you think. And he presents all sorts of data like this. People believing things are getting worse when in fact they're getting better. This is a good news talk. I mean, you thought you were coming to a downer about misinformation, but I hope I send you out feeling something somewhat cheerful. For example, if you look at, I'll just take the right column: child labor, nuclear arms, smoke particles, ignore Ottawa County, world hunger. Those things are all going down. Bad things are going down. Good things are going up, from girls in school in the upper right to world literacy in the lower left. The world has got to be a better place. And let's look at our own nation. Here's what's happened to the average per person inflation adjusted, what's called disposable income in the United States over the last 60 years. It's like tripled, thanks partly to increased wages, partly to increases in non-wage forms of income, and partly to the increase in married women's employment, meaning we have more people earning money, which would tend to raise the average. So things are headed up. And as a result, compared to the home in which you were a preschooler, which did not have air conditioning, your home today has air conditioning. You have a dishwasher, which most of us didn't have as young children. We have color television, which didn't exist when we were preschoolers. We have washing machines. Some of us had washing machines, but a lot of us didn't. And the proportion of our family income that is being spent on food as a necessity has radically declined. The world is getting better in so many ways. It's getting safer, it's getting healthier, we're living longer. I mean, the list could just go on and on and on and on. But if you ask Americans, how is life today for people 50 years ago, say? 58% of Americans in a recent survey this spring said life is worse today than it was 50 years ago. Again, it's this widespread perception that everything's headed downhill, when in fact, most things are, not everything, but most things are headed uphill. And it's not trivial, because democracy depends on an informed public. And politicians will readily exploit and fan the fires of this misinformation. Our country is in decline. We're a failing nation. Elect me and I will make things great again. So there you have it. Take a breather if you want. 10, to me, striking examples of radical misinformation, among others that could be given. Now, to a psychological scientist and one who reports on psychological research and textbooks and so forth, this is like really interesting. This is a striking human phenomenon. So I wonder, what explains this? What explains this extreme misinformation? Some of it is just plain disinformation. It's planted fake news. It's lies that attempt to manipulate us. It's lies in the guise of news. Some of it is, not much of it, but it's kind of fun. As an example, is satire that people take seriously and don't understand as satire. So for example, Borowitz in the New Yorker headlines that Trump sends January 6th committee a note from his podiatrist explaining why he can't be interviewed, or Pelosi says she will skip Trump and negotiate directly with Putin, or the CDC quietly admits that vaccines cause antibodies. Or just this week, there was a hoax from a website. If you look at the bottom, it was the DunningKrugerTimes.com. I mean, this is so funny to me as a sociologist, that had this fake publicity of Garth Brooks, who's tremendously popular in Texas, being booed off the stage by a woke crowd. And Greg Abbott tweeted this out, not realizing that it was a fake satire, and lamented it. So those are all kind of explanations of some misinformation. It's disinformation, or it's misunderstood satire. But more interesting to people in my profession are some other phenomena. The first I would call the truth bias, and it's our natural disposition to believe what other people say. And that has served us and our ancestors well over time. Other people are a valid source of information. So our default setting, if somebody tells us something, is to believe it. But as my favorite detective, Miss Marple, once said, people I find are apt to be far too trustful and sometimes to believe things they're told that is not true. I want, however, to focus here on several other phenomena. The first is the amazing persuasive power of mere repetition. The second is what we know as the availability heuristic, and I'll unpack that because this is the most important one of all. And then I'm going to briefly mention research on confirmation bias and on where I cut my eye teeth in the discipline on group polarization. And we'll also briefly at the end talk about how hard it is to unbelieve something once you've come to believe it. So that's just a little kind of overview of where we're going here. First, thinking about the persuasive power of mere repetition. You've heard it again and again and again, and the American public has. Vaccines cause autism. Vaccines cause autism. Vaccines cause autism. Climate change is a hoax. The 2020 election was stolen. Muslim terrorism is a grave threat. Now, in each of these cases, there are facts that refute the widespread assumption of these repeated and oft-believed statements. So, for example, since 9/11, in one period that was in the 8 years or so following, 7 years following, there were 230,000 US murders, only 123 of which were by Muslim terrorists. Somebody noted that toddlers kill more Americans than terrorists, and Snopes, which does fact checking, found that that's actually a true statement. Toddlers that get their hands on family guns. A toddler, one news report noted, has shot a person every week in the US for 2 years straight, which caused one person to comment, whoever this toddler is, they must be stopped. So what explains this extreme misinformation is and what gives repetition its power is, first of all, that repeated statements, whether true or false, become easier to process. There's what's called a fluency effect. They feel more familiar, they're easier to say and think about, and what's familiar feels true. And secondly, what you hear repeatedly, you remember, and you can't forget it. And it's there, it sticks to the mind like peanut butter, if you will. And all great propagandists have recognized this phenomenon. Adolf Hitler, all effective propaganda must be limited to a very few points and must harp on these in slogans. George Orwell had his slogans in 1984, repeated over and over again as part of the political education of the people. The Nazi propagandist Goebbels, if you tell a lie often enough and people keep repeating it, people will eventually come to believe it. Donald Trump, if you say it often enough and keep saying it, they will start to believe you. And so we have crooked Hillary and so forth. But it's not just Republicans who know the power of this principle. Hakeem Jeffries, the leader of the House Democrats, urges his compatriots to use repetition of key words: betrayal, abuse of power, national security. In fact, this phenomenon is so powerful, the power of mere repetition, that it even applies to statements that you know to be ridiculously untrue. And this was shown in a recent experiment in which even implausible statements became more plausible with repetition. Elephants run faster than cheetahs. Well, okay, you know that's not true, but after hearing this repeated and reading this several times, you still think it's untrue, but you're not quite so sure. Now you think it's probably untrue. I mean, it sort of begins to erase or corrode your belief. Okay, that's the power of repetition. Number two here is what I call the availability heuristic, which is a concept that was given us by the Nobel Prize-winning psychologist Daniel Kahneman, who created behavioral economics. And it's the tendency of people to judge the likelihood of an event by the ease with which instances of it come to mind. If examples of something like a plane crash are readily available as instances in our mind, we tend to think it happens more often because that's our heuristic. That's our kind of rule of thumb that we use to judge the frequency with which things happen when we don't have access to the statistics, which most people don't. And it's a very powerful, in some ways, corrosive phenomena. Steve Pinker at Harvard, when asked, what's one thing wrong with the world that you would change and why? It's people's tending to surrender to the cognitive bias of assessing the world through vivid, cognitively available anecdotes rather than data and facts. And so if we ask, why do people intuitively so often fear the wrong things like airplane crashes? Well, of course, we fear what our ancestral history has prepared us to fear: enclosed spaces, heights. I understand that. And we fear what we can't control. And when I'm in seat 17B with Delta this afternoon, I won't be in any control as I am when I'm behind the wheels of my car driving to the airport. But the most important principle here is that we tend to fear what's most readily available in memory. And we have these vivid images of airplane disasters. We don't cover the planes that land, journalists remind us. We cover the planes that don't land. And so we see a very uneven distribution of reality when we read the newspapers. And don't blame journalists. I mean, what's news if Delta lands safely in Atlanta for me today? And as a result of this phenomenon, our intuitive feelings often hijack our thinking much more often than our rational thinking about factual reality and statistical reality rules our thinking, rules our feelings, unless you're a weird guy, kind of nerdy like me, that lives his life by the numbers. And another example of the cognitive effects of the availability heuristic. Again, a little bit controversial, but think about the data, think statistically. And that is our fear of guns in schools, post-Parkland and with other horrific things that have happened in schools. A majority of US teens have reported fearing a shooting could happen at their school. Most parents share their concern. Schools are spending billions of dollars to protect themselves against mass shooters. They're having lockdown drills that engage children in rehearsing the victim of a terrorist or murderous attack coming with AK-47s into their school. Even though the statistical reality is that more children die of lightning strikes than of mass shootings. And the Harvard risk expert, David Bropek, having done the numbers, has calculated that the odds of a child's being shot and killed at school on any given day they're real. I mean, we need to keep our children safe. I understand horrible things are happening, but the odds of something terrible happening at West Middle School or whatever are far lower than almost any other mortality risk a kid faces, including traveling to and from school or playing sports or having guns in the home in neighborhoods, for example. Here's the number of kids killed by guns due to suicides, homicides, and mass shootings. And as you can see, guns are indeed dangerous, but the real danger of guns is guns in the home rather than people invading the school with guns. So when I speak to teachers, as I was privileged to do last Friday at a conference at Duke University, I tell them, let's teach it. The plural of anecdote is not data. We want to educate our students to think critically, to think analytically, to think influenced by evidence and not just by readily available anecdote. The next phenomenon, one you've likely heard of, I want to illustrate how it was discovered, and I won't take the time to actually do this demonstration, which I could because I don't want to cut into our discussion time, but the researcher did this, and I've used this as a class demonstration many times. He said, I have in mind a simple rule that's illustrated in this series of 3 numbers, 2, 4, 6. Now, I want you to see if you can guess the rule. And the way to guess the rule is to test your guess by writing down additional 3 number sequences, which I'll indicate either do or don't illustrate the rule, and then continue until you're confident that you know the rule. Okay? So if we were doing this experiment, you could think in your own mind about what you might write as an additional series of 3 numbers, leading me to tell you that either confirms or doesn't confirm the rule, and we'll continue until you're confident you've got it, okay? So what people did is they typically illustrated what's called confirmation bias. They sought to test the accuracy of their beliefs by seeking evidence that would confirm them rather than disconfirm them. So if they formed a rule, maybe it's counting by 2s. Then they would do 8, 10, 12. And he would say, yep, that illustrates the rule. Okay. 2022, 24. Yes. And after about 4 or 5 of these trials, they would be absolutely confident they got it, but they didn't, because the rule was any 3 ascending numbers. And the only way you could discover that rule is by giving a sequence that if he said yes, would disconfirm your prior belief. But that's not our natural tendency. Our natural tendency is to seek evidence that confirms what we already believe. T.S. Eliot recognized this long ago. We shall not cease from exploration. And the end of all our exploring will be to arrive where we started because of our biased information search. And thus it is the case in so many areas of human experience that we not only see what we believe, but we believe what we see. 2/3 of what we see is behind our eyes. It's often predisposed by the expectations and the beliefs that we bring. And that's what enables, for example, at the time of the 2016 election, Trump voters by a 5-to-1 margin to believe that Barack Obama was Muslim, while those voting for Hillary Clinton by a 5-to-1 margin thought he was Christian. Now, he was one or the other, right? One of those beliefs is right. But in the face of all evidence, people could find evidence because of their biased information search that tended to support what they previously believed. Next phenomenon, and now we're moving near the end, is one where I've done the research along with others. It's a phenomenon called group polarization. And what we found is that if you take people who share a particular belief, like in one of our experiments, we gathered people who tended to be relatively more or less prejudiced and put them in small groups with people who shared their beliefs to discuss racial issues and indicate their attitudes on specific scenarios. At the end of their discussion with like-minded others, they tended to be even more extreme in their views, and the two sets of populations were even more polarized. It turns out, little did we anticipate, that the internet and the growth of cable media would take this phenomenon of people aggregating themselves into like-minded tribes and reinforcing their beliefs off each other and amplifying those beliefs to a huge scale. And thus, on the internet, we can look at the networks of reds with reds and blues with blues, and very little networking and exposure across lines. You all grew up when you think of television media with CBS, NBC, and ABC giving us basically the same information to all Americans. And now we can select our information that helps confirm our beliefs, and then we share that with other like-minded people because our friends tend to share our political views. And lo and behold, there's now an extreme partisan hatred. And I'm going to share with you an essay that shows the increase in the number of people who think those in the other party are dishonest, they're immoral. Above all, they're just plain stupid, some recent research shows. So to recap, I first tried to show you that I think we do in some sense live in a post-truth world in which in many important realms, opinion and feelings trump facts. That's the case partly because of the truth bias, our natural tendency to believe what others say. It's partly due to the extraordinary power of repetition. It's due to the power of cognitively available, if unrepresentative, media and experiences that we've had. It's partly due to our natural confirmation bias. It's partly due to group polarization, to our tending to aggregate with others who think like we do and reinforce one another. And finally, it's partly due, and those beliefs are sustained by, a phenomenon that's called belief perseverance. Once you come to believe something, it's really hard to let it go, to unbelieve it. And this was demonstrated in some recent research on what's called asymmetry and belief revision that found it's easier to believe than to unbelieve. People will more often come to believe a claim they once thought false than to unbelieve something they once thought true. And in their laboratory experiments, for example, they gave people information like Michelangelo's statue of David is in Venice. Okay, you know, where is it? Or I'll try Florence, I think. Okay, but you knew it wasn't in Venice, but most people don't know that. But once they're persuaded of that, and once they're told that, they easily believe it. I mean, what do they know? Once they believe it, to get them to unbelieve that, to let go of that, is harder in the laboratory. And we've also seen that in real life. And one striking example were public surveys done of Americans' opinions about undertaking the Iraq War before the war. Most Americans supported the war effort on the assumption and the condition that there were weapons of mass destruction. If there were no such, then we weren't for the war. Okay, we undertook the war. It turned out the UN's inspector was right. There were no weapons of mass destruction. So what do we think about the war effort? Well, Americans still believe now they had a new reason. Saddam Hussein was a really evil guy and it was good to get rid of him. So we constructed a new explanation, but we didn't let go of the belief, the foundation of which had now been discounted in everybody's mind. Okay, those are some examples of misinformation. Those are some explanations. Finally, some antidotes. One is gathering and making available evidence. And of course, we're trying to educate our students to be like this kid. What do we want? Evidence-based science. When do we want it? After peer review. I just thought I'd throw in 3 examples of how surprising data have changed my mind from what I used to think. I mean, this is what I think should be happening. Like long ago, I would never have believed that electroconvulsive therapy would be an effective antidote for disabling depression. I mean, shocking people into unconsciousness. I mean, what's therapeutic about that? And yet it's for otherwise disabling depression that resists drugs and other psychotherapy and whatever, it has been a salvation for many people. Or consider this one. This is a little more fundamental and it's actually more shocking. Certainly it's something that changed the way I used to think. And that is the repeated finding. It's the biggest finding of behavior genetics research and one of the biggest findings of psychological science is that the parental influence on developing children's personality and intelligence is shockingly modest. In behavior genetics terms, it's called the shared environment effect. And we see that from a couple of kinds of studies. One, looking at adopted siblings who share the same home environment, the same school, the same neighborhood, everything's the same, but they're like genetically, a kind of random mix, if you will. They are in their personalities and intelligence hardly more similar than any 2 children paired at random, despite having shared the same parents. Or we know from twin studies, of which some 15 million twins have now been studied worldwide in 3,000 studies. And one of the bottom line findings, as summarized in a recent review, is that across all traits, the reported heritability is 49%. That is the extent to which differences between individuals are attributable to genetic influence. And that's not surprising. What's surprising is the data are inconsistent with substantial influences from shared environment. So something else is affecting those kids. And in some sense, this can be somewhat reassuring if you're worried about whether your method of toilet training or your children's method of handling their children are doing, maybe having toxic effects. Probably if they just basically love the children. I mean, there's a difference between children that are unloved and neglected or abused and those that are lovingly cared for. But within those that are lovingly cared for, it's hard to find environmental effects. Shocking result, but there you have it. Or what about this? I've had in my textbook, there's this diagnostic category called wintertime depression, also known as seasonal affective disorder. But now we have data from one study from 34,000 participants in the nationwide CDC health surveys that asked, is depression more common around the winter solstice? Is it more common for those living in cloudy areas like West Michigan and in Los Angeles? Is it more common on cloudy days? Is it more common in higher latitudes with less winter light? Is it more common in northern Norway than it is in Mexico and so forth? The answer to all these questions is no, 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 and no, across 34,000 randomly sampled people. Well, hold it. So I did a little kind of, again, I like to kind of check these things out. I went to Google Trends and checked what people are searching for across months of the year. And first I put in basketball. And what do you know? That increases in winter and in peaks in March. People are searching for the word basketball. Or what about flu? Again, that's seasonally related. And so we see people searching for the words flu increase in winter. What about depression or sadness? Or I am sad or I am depressed? No real change across the year. And so that fits what these other researchers are finding. It's not that people don't get depressed in winter, but when they do, they tend to attribute it to darkness and wintertime, when in fact, that's not a predictive variable, or so it seems. I'm trying to persuade my co-author, by the way, we need to take this out of the book. And so we're having, but it's another example where I believe something, but then the evidence tells me it just isn't true. Or, and by the way, I'm again, think back to Miss Marple. It wasn't what I expected, but facts are facts. And if one is proved to be wrong, one must just be humble about it and start again. Okay, science works, but education works too. And we know that education predicts decreased belief in conspiracy theories. And that's why what we do at Hope College across the street, teaching critical thinking, teaching analytical thinking, is important. Across the political spectrum, educated thinkers are better at evaluating evidence. And so, conclude this recent review, educators should focus on increasing basic science literacy and critical thinking, rather than the ideologies that purportedly divide people. And we do that partly by inculcating a scientific attitude towards all of life. It's an attitude that begins with a spirit of curiosity that asks, does it work? And so, like, I guess I hadn't thought about this till this moment, but my wonderingness about seasonal affective disorder, and then I'm curious, I need to check it out. And so I, check for the data and so forth. When put to the test, who's right? It's an attitude of skepticism, not cynicism. Cynicism doubts everything. Skepticism just asks, what do you mean? How do you know? And a spirit of humility, about which I'll say more in a minute. We have to be prepared to acknowledge that we might be wrong. Judge Learned Hand had the right idea. The spirit of liberty and of democracy is the spirit which is not too sure that it's right. Now, in an age in which people of faith in the United States are often associated with anti-science views, I remind people, as I did my teaching colleagues at Duke last week, that they can help their religious students understand that there is a religious ground or mandate for rigorous science. And it goes something like this. If you're a theist, there's two things you believe. I don't care what variety you are, whether you're evangelical or Unitarian or whatever. There's two things you believe. Number one, there is a God. Number two, it's not me and it's not you. We are finite, fallible, error-prone creatures. And believing that, we should therefore hold our own untested beliefs lightly. We should assess others' ideas with open-minded skepticism. And when appropriate, we should use observation and experimentation to winnow error from truth. And that's the idea that helped mandate and launch the very idea of science in the 17th century. And humility is important if we're to be able to the humility that grows from this theism and recognizing that there is a God, but it's not us, is important for understanding and recognizing misinformation, as is evident in some brand new research on what's called the bullshit blind spot. And what they did in this research is invite people to discriminate between aphorisms that express genuine, highly regarded wisdom, like a river cuts through a rock, not because of its power, but its persistence, and fake algorithm-generated statements where you just took nouns and verbs and adjectives and kind of put them together randomly, like wholeness quiets infinite phenomena. Well, it turned out that the people who were the most susceptible to falling for mere bullshit are those that think they're better at detecting it than the average person. Whereas people who are best at detecting it are actually underconfident in their detection skills. This would be sort of another example of the Dunning-Kruger effect. And so, conclude the researchers, everyone would be better off practicing more intellectual humility. Okay, that's the gist of what I have to say, but with one footnote. It's not the whole story. And so as I communicate my discipline in textbooks, I want to teach this kind of critical thinking. But I also want to teach people to appreciate the wonder of our humanity. E.B. White wrote, "I arise in the morning torn between the desire to save the world and a desire to savor the world." And the marvels of our human existence also deserved appreciation and savory. Consider, if you will, an alien species that could pass thoughts from one head to another merely by pulsating air molecules in the space between them, a science fiction novel, perhaps. Whereas actually, it's us. So right now, I have ideas in my head that I'm transforming into the motions of my larynx and vocal cords and mouth, which are causing pulsating air molecules to travel through space, which are, when they strike your eardrum, causing the bones of the middle ear to vibrate, which send fluid-filled waves down the cochlea, which trigger the auditory nerve to send electrical impulses up to the brain. And what do you know? From outer air pressure waves to mechanical waves of the middle ear to fluid waves of the inner ear to electrical waves to perceiving sound, at the end of this process, it works. We have right now mind-to-mind communication via vibrating air molecules. Is that spectacular? I mean, and that's just audition. Vision is even more complex and more spectacular, which is why I wouldn't deign to explain it, much less with Tom Ahrensor sitting in front of me. Surely what the psalmist said is true. We are fearfully and wonderfully made. And that lesson also needs to be taught. And so my message to educators is help your students think smart. Help them prioritize facts over feelings, evidence over intuition, data over mere anecdote, to embrace a curious, open spirit of humility. We can do that. And at the same time, remind them to have a heart. Remind them that they are, as we all are, wonderfully made. Well, I have a new little book of essays, just one little plug on curiosities and marvels of the human mind, 40 little short essays if you're interested. And I'm going to distribute now a couple sample essays that are going up in my blog or have just done so that relate to some of what we're talking about today. And so if you want to communicate with me in any way, you can do so through my website or visit the blog site. And it's just been a delight to be with you here for the last hour. Thank you. So I'm open to questions. And Tom and John, maybe you could distribute those. And just there's
an acronym, FEAR, false expectations appearing real. And my oldest son lives in the city of Chicago, and he was raised in a upper end white collar community in Illinois and the Chicago suburbs. And he has a job and but it's third shift. And he says, it's really dangerous to take the train at night because it's really filled with all these homeless people. And I'm really kind of concerned. Now I can take the train home at night in the morning because all of the rush hour people are there. And it kind of reminded me of this situation that's happened in New York. We have a situation there where I'm not going to get into the legal elements of it, other than the fact that it's very possible that the young man that tried to restrain the guy that unfortunately he killed was out of fear, that he thought this person is a danger to everybody else on the train. And it wasn't as though he could think and say, look, this guy just needs to be escorted off the train and it'll be okay. But it's like, that's where our filter of reality can interfere with our logic. And so when we say, what are the cities like? I could see why my son in Chicago is like, oh, gee, the public transportation, blah, 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 is not good and all that. It's what is. And with that, I'll let you
Right,
go.
right. So thank you for that. And of course, the data I've shared compare people's perceptions of their immediate situation to the nation as a whole. There are, of course, relatively more and less dangerous situations. So I don't want to deny any of that for the moment. And so your son could be quite right that he's more at risk riding the subway home than he would be going in the morning. Whether he's accurately calibrating his degree of risk relative to the actual risk is something it's a separate question, and I don't know the answer to it. Okay.
We have a question from the chat. Jim asks about your COVID information at the beginning. Does that suggest that we were wrong to shut down schools and to go virtual?
I'm not the CDC, not a medical scientist, so I don't want to presume expertise that I don't have. But there was a very important reason for college students who were not at mortal risk to mask, to get vaccinated, and to take precautions, and likewise in schools. And that is because even if it didn't kill them, they are part of the communal transmission process. And so there's been a suggestion that we need to have intergenerational altruism. Older people need to, as they think about tax policies and so forth, to think about the needs of young families and children today, and to keep their needs as well as their own in mind. Young people during COVID can reciprocate that by masking and minimizing the spread of disease that will affect their parents and especially their grandparents, and that's reason enough to be cautious.
I had a question about data and science. Early in your presentation, you referenced a study that was funded by the Gates Foundation. We have a situation today where people will hear that and immediately say, oh, well, if it's funded by the Gates Foundation, it must be bad science, because my thinking tells me that the Gates Foundation leans in one way or another.
Sure.
So any science that's developed.
Of course, I mean, they're planting microchips
Right.
in vaccines, so.
That's right.
Right, go ahead.
So I guess.
That was a joke, by the way.
Yeah, no. So, how do we help people understand the scientific method, even that it really doesn't matter who funds it? There's going to be right-leaning, perhaps, institutions that fund science and left-leaning or institutions that fund science. It doesn't mean it's bad or good science. That good science follows a certain process, but oftentimes people will just write off the science because of who funded it.
First, I mentioned this was a Gates funded survey. I didn't even mention that, but I thought that with this audience, it's like, who did this survey? And so it lends a little bit of credibility likely for this audience. Secondly, there will always be a fair substantial number of people who we will never reach with education and who are going to believe extreme misinformation that is radically untrue and even destructive and even toxic to their own lives to believe. In the political world, if you care about climate change or, what federal policies or whatever, that's okay, because the world is shaped by the 10% in the middle, if you will, who cast votes and establish policies that determine the future. And so I wouldn't be optimistic about persuading everybody of what seems to me, and the evidence suggests is in fact the truth. Rather, my mission is to try to, first of all, as an educator and somebody who has the attention of a lot of people, to try and communicate truth in this scientific attitude to large numbers of people, including, by the way, in the state of Florida, where our AP text is now under threat of being canceled by the state of Florida. And also just again, to remember that it's the people in the undecided, what's sometimes called the muddled middle, that are the target audience for our best efforts.
David, I really appreciated your identifying some of the mechanisms of misinformation. And it seems like it could be said that misinformation creates fear. But I think that turns around the other way, that perhaps the reason we have so much misinformation now is because we have too much fear. Fear drives people to try to find certainty and through shortcuts and unreasonable ways and grab onto misinformation. The rate of change of things going on in the last, now is much higher than it was when I was a kid, and change makes people fearful. And when you're fearful, you grab some misinformation.
Right.
That's
Good,
just
good
a thought
comment.
about whether you think fear itself is just one of these mechanisms that supports misinformation.
Yeah, fear of change. And thus, and harkening back to 50 years ago, and that's why we think life was better 50 years ago. And in some ways, it probably was in terms of communal relationships and family integrity and so forth. But in most ways, I mean, all things considered, you really wouldn't want to live your life over again, adjusted 50 years earlier. You're glad to have lived when you did. And your children are probably glad they're alive now rather than were born 50 years previously. Thank you. Thanks for the comment. Judy, here is this.
I think of the context here in Ottawa County of what's happened to our county commissioners. Ottawa Impact, we've sort of been hijacked by an extremist group. How can we prevent that kind of thing in the future other than voting?
Again, that's getting into a political sphere that I wary about getting into. I would say it's hard once people believe something that's not true to debunk that and erase that from their mind. I made that point. What I could have gone on to say is there's research that shows that though debunking is hard, pre-bunking is often effective. That is, if you forewarn people about possible misinformation, if you cognitively immunize them, that information can work the way a vaccine immunization does. It's a weakened form of the virus that they're going to be exposed to. It stimulates the body's defenses and prepares them to reject an actual full-scale attack on their body. And that could be done persuasively too. So it's better to pre-bunk. It's easier to pre-bunk and prevent misinformation than it is to get rid of it once the virus is out there and circulating. Judy wants the microphone back. And something tells me that Judy might have a thought about her own, the answer to her own question.
There's examples where pre-bunking, I think, is what disrupted when Attorney General having to do with I can't remember all the details, but an Attorney General, yeah, he predisposed people's views by his own pre-interpretation of something.
Of the Mueller report.
Yeah, the Mueller report.
Thank
and
you.
Another example, somebody published early in I think a Wall Street Journal, a response to something that was going to be critical to him that would be more widely spread later. And so people are using this in a way that
That's
serves their self-interest.
Yeah. So Judge Alito just did that with his editorial in the Wall Street Journal.
That's it.
In anticipation of the revelation that he had been funded for this travel by a billionaire friend. Yeah, so that's a good point. So pre-bunking, and in fact, all these mechanisms can be used for various purposes. So I mean, it's a little bit like nuclear power, which can light up cities or blacken them. I mean, it's a power. It's a mechanism that's powerful. Yes.
Okay, I have a comment more. I don't think we can do anything statistically about it. But it could be a person, someone we trust. So it could be a person, it could be a politician, it could be a news reporter, like we all have our favorite 6:30 news station, which that we think is better than the other couple or so on. If we really trust a person already, and then they're accused of anything, I have found anyway, that I can give that person a little leeway. Let's see what happens with it. Perhaps this was an error, maybe, let's see what happens. I would give them a break. But if it's someone I really don't want to keep going in whatever area they're going, I agree completely when I first hear it.
Right. So that brings to mind a couple examples. One, if you take statements and ask people whether they agree or disagree with them. Their response to a given statement will vary tremendously, whether you attribute it to Mao Zedong or to Ronald Reagan, say, who in many cases said exactly the same thing. And so our tendency to believe or accept something depends on who says it, not just what the content is. Another comment another thought that is stimulated by your good remark is that what matters for how we feel and think is not just what we know, but who we know. This is especially and most vividly true when it comes to our attitudes towards gay and lesbian people. As attitudes have dramatically changed in the United States over the last 30 years, they've been influenced, I would wish it were by the information that people like me are communicating about sexual orientation and the evidence that it's, for most people, a natural enduring disposition, and that covenant partnership is healthy for human lives and so forth. But in fact, it's even more influenced by who you've come to know. If there's somebody you love and care about within your circle of friendship or family, that tends to be powerfully important. Peg.
Dave, I think because of your Christian commitment, it would be helpful if you have thoughts on how it is that we are losing so many people of church membership. Why are they not taking the gospel as more serious wisdom? Any comments that you have on that?
First of all, you're absolutely right about the de-churching of America and the increase in religious nuns, N-O-N-E-S. And it just so happens that a world expert on that is one floor above you right now, my colleague Daryl Van Togeren, who's now directing the Frost Research Center. It's not been announced, but just within the last 2 weeks. By the way, he's one of the most prolific young psychologists in America. He's like 10 years out from his PhD. He has like 200 publications and multiple grants. He's just gotten another $500,000 Templeton grant to explore spiritual yearnings in young people and the phenomenon of the de-churching of America. And so if you want to talk on that, you have to go one floor up to get a world expert to speak on that. So first of all, the phenomenon is absolutely right. And then the question is, why is that? I mean, for so long, the United States has resisted the secularization trends of Western Europe. But now, certainly during COVID, of course, actual in-person church attendance plummeted, but it hasn't rebounded back to where it was before. Interesting phenomenon, by the way, highly educated people are now more likely to be attending church than less educated people. It used to be a little more the reverse. And, I think one question one can at least ask, and some sociologists, religions have asked this, it's probably just a small contributing factor, but I think it's a contributing factor, is the extent to which evangelicalism has become, what self-described evangelicals, most of whom don't attend church, by the way, have become kind of the public face of Christianity, and the kind of the PR disaster that has been for the faith with younger people. And especially, I mean, I'm on the board of trustees of my alma mater, which is a Reformed Evangelical Presbyterian school out in the state of Washington. And its trustees have just wrestled with the question of whether to add sexual orientation to its non-discrimination policy statement. That decision was made yesterday, and it's going to be announced to the campus community in 2 hours, so I can't tell you what it is. But the question we face is, should we follow the example of Seattle Pacific University and of Calvin University in adopting a kind of anti-gay posture that restricts employment of people who are gay people or in gay relationships? Seattle Pacific has had a PR disaster with young people over that issue. They've had admissions collapse. They've just announced that they're letting go 40% of their faculty a year from now. Calvin is down in undergraduate enrollment and is stressed by internal turmoil. 3,000 people signing a petition to the trustees to change this policy. One of their demoralized faculty, who's top clinical psychologist, is moving to our department because Hope has added sexual orientation and gender identity and expression to its non-discrimination policy and applied it to all aspects of hiring and campus life. A year ago, Hope had an aim of 800 new student deposits and ended up with 1,000. And Let the Summer Melt take that down to 950. This year, they've ended up with like 850 new student deposits. And it was only that low because they were turning students away. Because the dorms are full. We're just simply at capacity. We can't take anymore. So I've talked to the admissions director and others. Is Hope's more welcoming, inclusive posture more winsome as a Christian witness to young adults, as well as some biblical scholars like Jim Brownson at Western Seminary would say, more biblically faithful, and certainly more true to what we've come to understand about the realities of sexual orientation and covenant partnership? You can tell what my answer to that question is, but so again, I'm just thinking out loud here, but you've got a world-class expert who's just gotten a $500,000 grant to study this further and has already published a number of things that's sitting right now, one floor above you.
There was a statistic, I shouldn't say a statistic, something was released yesterday that nurses in the United States are contemplating leaving the field, and it was like 36 or 39%. My question is, when they release information like that, does it spur, actions to try to retain them, or does it create more interest in leaving the field? What would the influences be?
Yeah, I don't know. I truly don't know. Again, just trying to think out loud. Certainly the purpose of whoever did that and released that probably is to try to motivate healthcare institutions to take steps to empower and compensate their healthcare staff to retain them. And so that's like what should happen. And I think each individual nurse knows what she or he feels and is experiencing, is going to base their decision on that and not on some statistic they read. That would be my hunch, but good.
Since nobody had a hand up, I'll ask you another question. Years ago, you did a panel on the gay population, and at that point, it appeared that it was about 4%. Where do you feel it is now in terms of the study that would be not just self-determination, but scientifically determined?
Well, okay, so there's kind of two questions. One is people's identity and what do they declare themselves as? How do they declare their identity on national surveys, such as done by Gallup or the National Opinion Research Center or whatever? And so that number has actually been increasing, particularly among younger people. And by the way, the LGBT has been increasing primarily because of the binary, that is the number of younger kids who are calling themselves but in the binary category. Now that rate, okay, let's see, I got to be careful here because I'm not the expert, but I can tell you there's two additional questions that could be asked. One is sexual behavior changing? Is the number of people who are engaging in same-sex partnerships or same-sex behaviors increasing commensurate with the increase in the number of people who declare their identities as LGBT? And the answer to that seems to be no. So that's a somewhat more stable figure. It's increased somewhat. Secondly, we have particularly in teens and especially in teen girls, a significant increase in the number who are declaring themselves as not as binary, sexually binary rather than male or female. The speed with which and the extent to which that has happened suggests that there's a social phenomenon at work here that's influencing teen identity. I mean, that's become a little bit kind of well, I don't want to explain it further, but it just, when you see anything like that happen, the number of people who say they have PTSD or ADHD or anything, if it suddenly explodes, then there's probably some social influence that's helping feed that. 30 years ago, feminist psychologists popularized the concept of androgyny. Sandra Bem was a feminist psychologist who reminded us that for both boys and girls, for both men and women, there are various ways to be male and female. You can be prototypically feminine female, or you can be a female, a girl that has more masculine, more traditionally masculine interests. And that's okay. I mean, you're an androgynous person, but your identity is still female. Or you could be a boy who has rugged masculine interests, loves football, but maybe has interests that are more typical of girls. But your identity is still boy. You're still heterosexual. You're just more androgynous rather than gender typed in your interests. I think we've lost something when we've lost that concept, because today that concept is not so cognitively available to teens who may be, in my words, androgynous, who may be girls who don't fit what society is saying is kind of the feminine mold. And so they adopt a different identity. I mean, I think you don't have to. You could be a girl and be androgynous. You could be a boy and be androgynous. You don't have to fit into the socially prescribed gender type stereotypes. That would just be kind of my off the top reflection. But I'm an 80-year-old cisgender white male, so forth. So by the way, I've even drafted something. I decided not putting those thoughts on the blog because, I'm just not confident enough about what I'm saying right now. I'm just talking to you as a friend. I need you to have the mic. So.
Is there any scientific evidence of change in numbers?
Numbers of what?
People
In
who-
numbers, identity is changing. Yes, that's clear. Okay. But particularly among younger people, but the number of people that are behaving in same-sex partnerships is not increasing commensurate with the identity shifts. That's what I'm saying.
I would also think that the more accepting we are, the more we are going to find people not hiding what they feel. And I think that will play into the numbers also.
Very good point. Point worth making. And that certainly accounts for some of the change. Okay, it's 11 o'clock and I've got to catch a plane, but last comment goes to Tom.
Yeah.
Thank you.
Thank you, Dr. Myers.
Thank you.
Appreciate it. Blessing in my life. Thank you.
Thank you.
He did, yeah. It's amazing. He is. You did too. Thank you.
So, is there is this an extra one?
No, but